The rain hammered against the funeral home windows like accusations I'd been hearing my entire life. Inside, the scent of lilies mixed with the suffocating weight of family expectations and 37 years of disappointment. My father's casket sat surrounded by flowers from his successful friends, his business associates, his golden son, my brother Marcus. I stood in the back corner, wearing my only black suit, the one I'd bought at a thrift store for job interviews that never led anywhere. Marcus held court near the front, accepting condolences in his $1,000 suit, playing the role of the grieving heir to perfection. "Dad would be so proud of you," I heard someone tell him. Following in his footsteps, building the business, carrying on the family name. The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. "Unlike your failure of a brother." But 8-year-old Ethan, Marcus's son, kept glancing back at me with curious eyes that reminded me painfully of my father, when he still believed I might amount to something. The boy had barely spoken to me in years. Marcus made sure of that. But there was something in his expression today that I couldn't quite read. As the service began and the pastor spoke about legacy and family values, I felt the familiar weight of being the family disappointment. The brother who'd chosen art over business, dreams over dollars, passion over profit. The one who'd never married, never had children, never built anything my father could brag about at the country club. But sometimes the most important truths are whispered by the smallest voices. And today would change everything I thought I knew about failure and success. Growing up as Marcus's younger brother was like living in permanent eclipse. He was everything my father wanted in a son. Ambitious, ruthless, focused on the bottom line. By the time he was 25, Marcus had doubled the revenue of Dad's construction company. By 30, he'd expanded into 3 states. At 35, he was worth more money than our small town had ever seen. I was the artistic one, the dreamer, the son who saw beauty in abandoned buildings and possibility in broken things. While Marcus learned to read financial statements, I learned to read the stories that old walls could tell. While he networked at business dinners, I taught art classes at the community center for kids who couldn't afford private lessons. "You're wasting your talent," Dad used to say, the disappointment thick in his voice. "You could be making real money with that artistic eye, designing buildings, creating marketing campaigns. Instead, you're playing with finger paints with other people's children." The final break came 5 years ago, when Dad offered me a position at the company, not as a creative director or architect, but as a glorified janitor who could pretty up the job sites. When I declined, choosing instead to open a small art studio that barely paid my rent, he stopped speaking to me entirely. Marcus had been more direct. "You're a failure, Jamie," he'd said at last year's Christmas dinner, the only family gathering I'd attended in years. 37 years old, living in a studio apartment, no wife, no kids, no legacy. Dad's ashamed of you, and honestly, so am I. But what Marcus didn't know was that my failure had touched more lives than his success ever would. The kids I taught had gone on to art schools, won scholarships, found their voices through creativity. The murals I'd painted in low-income neighborhoods had brought color and hope to forgotten corners of our city. And Ethan, sweet, sensitive Ethan, had been watching it all with eyes that saw what the adults in his life had trained themselves to ignore. After the service, as people gathered in the fellowship hall for the reception, Marcus cornered me by the coffee station. His face was flushed with grief and something else, anger that had been building for years. "I can't believe you had the nerve to show up," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that nearby mourners couldn't hear. "Dad spent his last years disappointed in you. Do you have any idea how that felt for him? Watching his youngest son throw away every opportunity, every advantage he'd worked to give you." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to find the soft spots where my own doubts lived. "Marcus, No," he cut me off, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "You don't get to speak. You don't get to pretend you cared about him when you couldn't even be bothered to visit him in the hospital. Too busy playing with your paints to see your own father dying." The truth was more complicated, as it always was. I had tried to visit Dad in the hospital, but Marcus had made it clear I wasn't welcome. "He doesn't want to see you," he'd told me over the phone. "Seeing you just makes him more upset about how his life turned out." So I'd stayed away, carrying the guilt like a stone in my chest, wondering if my father had died, thinking I didn't care about him. "You're a failure, Jamie," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from years of resentment. "You always have been, and you always will be. Dad knew it, I know it, And deep down, you know it too. That's when I felt a small hand slip into mine. I looked down to see Ethan standing beside me, his 8-year-old face serious and determined. He'd approached so quietly that neither Marcus nor I had noticed him. "Uncle Jamie isn't a failure," Ethan said, his voice clear and strong despite his youth. "He's the best person I know." Marcus's face went white, then red. "Ethan, go find your mother. Now." But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he squeezed my hand tighter and looked up at his father with an expression that was far too mature for his age. The silence that followed Ethan's words was deafening. Around us, the gentle murmur of funeral conversation continued. But in our small corner by the coffee station, time seemed to have stopped. Marcus stared at his son with a mixture of shock and anger, while I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the warmth of being defended by someone who believed in me. "Ethan," Marcus said, his voice tight with control, "you don't understand what you're talking about. Go to your mother. Now." But Ethan stood his ground, his small chin lifted in defiance that reminded me painfully of myself at his age, before the world had taught me to doubt my own worth. "I do understand, Dad. Uncle Jamie teaches kids how to make beautiful things. He painted the mural at my school that makes everyone happy when they're sad. He's not a failure." The mural. I'd forgotten that Ethan's school was one of the places where I'd volunteered my time, painting a garden scene on the cafeteria wall that depicted children of all backgrounds playing together. It had taken me 3 weeks of evenings and weekends, working for free because the school couldn't afford to pay an artist. "That's just," Marcus started, but Ethan wasn't finished. "And when Tommy Peterson was crying because his dad left, Uncle Jamie sat with him and taught him how to draw his feelings. And when Maria couldn't afford art supplies, Uncle Jamie bought them with his own money. And when—" "Enough." Marcus's voice cracked like a whip, causing several nearby mourners to turn and stare. He grabbed Ethan's arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make his point. "We're going home. Now." But as Marcus tried to lead his son away, Ethan twisted in his grip and looked back at me with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond his years. What he said next, in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, would haunt me for days to come. "I want to be like you when I grow up, Uncle Jamie. Not like Dad." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. I watched my brother's face cycle through emotions: shock, hurt, anger, and something else that looked almost like fear. Marcus's grip on Ethan's arm tightened, and I saw something flash across my brother's face that I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Not fear of embarrassment or social judgment, but the deep, primal fear of a parent realizing they might be losing their child's respect. "Ethan, you don't mean that," Marcus said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You're upset because of Grandpa. You're not thinking clearly." But Ethan pulled free from his father's grip with surprising strength. "I am thinking clearly, Dad. I think clearly all the time. And I see how you treat Uncle Jamie. I see how you treat everyone who isn't rich like you." The conversation around us had begun to quiet as people sensed the tension in our corner. I could see my sister-in-law Sarah approaching, her face creased with concern as she navigated through the crowd of mourners. "You want to know what I see, Dad?" Ethan continued, his voice getting stronger with each word. "I see Uncle Jamie giving his lunch money to kids who forgot theirs. I see him staying after school to help kids with their art projects when their parents are too busy to care. I see him making people smile when they're sad." Marcus's face had gone pale. "Ethan, please." "And I see you," Ethan said, his 8-year-old voice carrying a weight that made my chest tight. "I see you yelling at people who work for you. I see you making Mom cry when you think I'm not watching. I see you being mean to Uncle Jamie because he's different." Sarah had reached us now, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what was happening. Other family members were beginning to notice the commotion, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch the drama unfolding. "What's going on here?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Your son," Marcus said through gritted teeth, "is being disrespectful to his father at his grandfather's funeral." But Ethan turned to his mother with that same serious expression. "Mom, why do you let Dad be mean to Uncle Jamie? Why doesn't anyone ever tell Dad he's wrong?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched Sarah's face crumble as she realized that her 8-year-old son had been observing family dynamics that the adults had convinced themselves were hidden. That's when Ethan did something that would change our family forever. Ethan stepped away from both his parents and moved closer to me, his small hand finding mine again. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet fellowship hall. reaching every ear in the room. "I want to tell everyone about Uncle Jamie," he announced, his 8-year-old voice cutting through the funeral atmosphere like a bell. "I want to tell them what he really does." "Ethan, no," Marcus started, but his son was already speaking, addressing the room full of mourners who had turned to listen. "My Uncle Jamie isn't a failure," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He teaches kids like me how to make art when their parents can't afford art classes. He painted the most beautiful mural at my school that makes everyone happy. He gives his own money to kids who need art supplies." The room was completely silent now. Every person focused on this small boy who was speaking with the kind of moral clarity that only children possess. I could see my father's business associates, the country club members, the people who had written me off years ago, all listening with growing attention. And when kids are sad or scared or angry, Uncle Jamie teaches them how to draw their feelings so they don't have to keep them inside where they hurt. Ethan continued. "He says art is like magic because it can turn bad feelings into beautiful things." Marcus tried to interrupt again, but Ethan's voice rose above his father's. "Dad says Uncle Jamie is a failure because he doesn't have a big house or a fancy car. But Uncle Jamie has something better. He has kids who love him, and art that makes people happy, and a heart that cares about everyone." I felt tears burning behind my eyes as this small boy, this child who barely knew me because his father had kept us apart, defended me with a passion and eloquence that shamed every adult in the room. "Grandpa always said that success is about making money," Ethan said, his voice beginning to waver with emotion. "But I think success is about making people feel better, and Uncle Jamie makes lots of people feel better." The silence that followed was profound. I could see faces around the room, people who had known my father, who had judged me, who had written me off as the family disappointment, looking at me with new eyes. Then Ethan turned to face his father directly, and what he said next would echo in my memory forever. "I don't want to be like Grandpa when I grow up," he said, his voice steady despite the tears now streaming down his face. "I don't want to be like you, Dad. I want to be like Uncle Jamie. I want to make people happy instead of making them scared." Marcus's face crumpled, not with anger this time, but with the devastating realization that his 8-year-old son had seen through all the facades, all the justifications, all the careful constructions of success and failure that our family had built over the years. "I want to be kind," Ethan whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "like Uncle Jamie." And in that moment, surrounded by the mourners at my father's funeral, I realized that maybe I hadn't failed after all. 6 months later, I sat in my small art studio, but it didn't feel small anymore. The walls were covered with artwork from my students, children whose creativity had flourished under encouragement rather than judgment. Among them was a drawing that Ethan had made during his first visit to my studio, a picture of 2 stick figures labeled, "Me and Uncle Jamie making art." Marcus had called me the week after the funeral, his voice thick with emotion I'd never heard before. "I've been thinking about what Ethan said," he'd begun, the words coming slowly, painfully, "about success and failure and what really matters." The conversation had lasted 3 hours. Marcus told me about the pressure he'd felt to live up to Dad's expectations, about how that pressure had turned him into someone he didn't recognize. He talked about the fear he'd seen in his employees' eyes, the way his wife flinched when he raised his voice, the growing distance between him and his son. "I don't want Ethan to be afraid of me," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I don't want him to think that success means making other people feel small." Now Ethan spent every Saturday afternoon with me, learning to paint and draw and see the world through an artist's eyes. Marcus had started therapy, working to understand how his definition of success had poisoned his relationships. Sarah had begun bringing their younger daughter to my classes too, but the most profound change was in how I saw myself. For 37 years I'd carried the weight of being the family failure, the disappointment, the son who hadn't lived up to expectations. But through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy, I'd discovered that success isn't measured in dollars or square footage or country club memberships. Success is measured in the smiles of children who've learned to express themselves through art, in the confidence of kids who've discovered they have something valuable to offer the world, in the quiet knowledge that you've made someone's life a little brighter, a little more beautiful, a little more hopeful. Sometimes it takes the voice of a child to remind us what really matters. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt like a failure in someone else's eyes, remember this. True success isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about the lives you touch, the kindness you spread, the difference you make in your own quiet way. Subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. There are people out there who think they've failed because they chose compassion over competition, heart over profit. Stories like this remind us that the most important victories are often the ones that can't be measured in dollars. Because sometimes the greatest success is simply being the person a child wants to become.